This is a bricklayer's tale, short segment of a chapter called Take It to the Church. The church was 13th century, very old. My boss had taken on the contract to repair the aisle, which was at serious risk of collapse. After centuries of supporting worshippers and parishioners, the central aisle was collapsing as the hallowed ground and its burial sites beneath gave way to the weight above. An exciting job in many ways, from a structural perspective anyway. The ground beneath the church had been used for burials and family tomb arrangements since its beginnings, but now the voids created were filling with the surrounding soil and left the space underneath the tiled floor empty. The job would be to excavate, dig out, as Les would say, the existing aisle, then form trenches every 6 feet across that aisle. These trenches would be sunk into the ground until a solid base was found and have 6 inches of concrete fill placed and a 1 brick thick engineering wall built to the height of the underside of the new concrete slam that would form the brand new aisle walkway. Quite a work of structural engineer in a confined, tight space, but the kind of work my bricklayer relished, particularly the 1 brick thick walls which would make him drawl like a dog, and ensured he pondered his next foreign holiday more vigorously than before. I was in the second year of my apprenticeship, 1982, as a bricklayer, and at 17 now pretty sure of myself and my abilities, and considered I was over the worst of the wet nursing, as Led described it. I was quite looking forward to starting this job, as Les had promised I would do most of the bricklaying on this one. A lie, of course, but I did have a tendency to believe anything he said. I have never been completely sure as to whether his face was completely fear-induced, a little bit of hero worship, or the hideous combination of both. Anyway, I rarely argued with him. The penance for such rebellion was always too fearful to consider, as I had learnt in the first year of my apprenticeship. Well, I thought I'd learnt. I had been doing an awful amount of general labouring during my first year, but now the physical effects of this were starting to pay off a little. I was physically fitter, my stamina had improved enormously. These were great tools. As an apprentice, you were constantly accused of being fucking thick, fucking lazy, or being a fucking puff, mainly because the physical requirements of what your peers expect you to do is initially impossible. How many 16-year-olds would you know that could lift a 15 kilogram bag of cement? And remember, picking one up does not count. Think in terms of lorry loads. Day one of the job consisted of the usual wander around, waiting for instruction, and the occasional motivational speech from Les. Why aren't you doing anything, you thick cunt? Starting jobs is always tricky, nearly as tricky as the finish, but perhaps not quite. The talking about and the imaginary planning are over, and the doing must begin, but not everyone's cup of tea. Even though on the lead up to a job, everyone and their dog appears to know best. Les did excel in this. He would always have an initial conundrum about what goes where, who does what and when, sequence of operations, and would make no bounds about the anxiety or stress he was experiencing. It was always best not to ask anything of Les during his pre-planning moments. I remember another apprentice, Martin, who asked Les if he wanted a cup of tea and a bacon sandwich during one of these computative moments. It took 3 of them to get him off Martin as he attempted to flush his head down the toilet. That, of course, is another saga from another job. Les would visualise the job from start to finish. A monstrous human being in the real world, but a machine when it came to building and making money. My governor, Mr. Galbraith, hated Les as an individual. You could always tell from the looks and mannerisms, and out of choice would never have probably wished to associate with him in any way. But Les knew how to get a job done, how to get the maximum out of people, not always in the best way, but most important of all, how to maximise the profitability of a job to make money. Les was exceedingly greedy, and you could feel the excitement and sense of pride when he thought he was wringing the very life out of Galbraith financially. One thing I didn't think Les ever worked out was that Mr. Galbraith really did use him for the best effect for this. Feeding Les's inflated ego and sense of importance, and always the bigger house and car, they seemed to have a weird kind of symbiotic relationship. I think Les always needed Mr. Galbraith as he lacked the ability and skills to communicate with clients in any meaningful or humane way, and Mr. Galbraith because he liked making money, which always Les did too. First the rubble, and what was left of the aisle were removed. This was laborious and difficult. No machine could get inside the church, so it was a shovel, wheelbarrow, and elbow grease that had to prevail, like some 16th century farce. The work was incredibly hard, and I lost count of how many times I skinned my knuckles manoeuvring a wheelbarrow through the church doors. The pain would be almost unbearable sometimes, and you would feel the tears well up. However, he never released them, as the lesson from Les on how to man up would be much worse. I guess his training methods must have worked, as I have very rarely cried throughout life. Health and safety would have gone mad. Good job then that Les would never considered any of that old shit, I guess. Once the site was cleared, the dusty, dried out earth beneath was revealed and we could see the issues. Holes and cracks had appeared everywhere and the ground looked very unstable. The trenches were marked out on the ground. The idea was to build sleeper walls every 2 meters from the doorway to the altar. The depth of the trenches would be dictated by the grounds, so we would have to dig down until solid chalk was uncovered. Surveying was not quite as it is today. The surveyor has suggested that perhaps the maximum depth we would have to go down would be 20 feet, but if we found chalk, it would be okay. As it was more than likely that I'd be digging most of the trenches, this was not the greatest prospect, particularly with Les shouting in your earhole all day. There was 4 of us on the job. Les was the foreman bricklayer, Steve his brother senior labourer, David, Les's other brother, general fucking idiot, Les's terminology, not mine, and me, the bricklaying apprentice, or as Les put it, the other fucking idiot. As with the site clearance, the trenches would have to be dug by hand, with the excavated material going into wheelbarrows and out. Myself and David were selected to dig the trenches. Steve would manage the waste away, and Les would manage the whole process while drinking copious amounts of flask matured tea and smoking a lot. So far so good, but everything went surreal the first day of digging. Throughout the centuries, the church and its grounds have been used for burial. This included inside the church and underneath the aisle. The number of burial sites under the aisle were in fact a major contributing factor to its collapse. There were hundreds of them. Family vaults and individual graves. Over time, the coffins had rotted away, causing voids in the ground, which filled the dry, dusty earth and then all collapsed in. So it wasn't just dirt we were digging out and removing. So on the first day, the vicar turned up and explained the process. If you find remains, they need to be collected carefully and with dignity. I will provide sacks for you to put them in, and at the end of the job, there will be a special ceremony where the remains will be put back into the ground outside the church. He put his hands together and his head down. Some of the burials here date back to the 13th century, and the last was in the 18th, in the aisle anyway. You have God's grace in this endeavour, as the aisle needs repair. Have no fear, you are doing God's work. I'm not sure what was more unnerving at that point, the idea that I was about to dig up dead people's remains, or Les's sniggers during the vicar's speech. Whatever this job now seemed to be the shit end of something. The vicar deposited his sacks and the work began. At first it was worrying, as myself and Dave started to spike the ground with spades. I had visions of some kind of blood-soaked zombie rising up and attacking us. The apprehension between us and the work must have been obvious. Start digging properly, you pair of cunts, Les tried to reassure us positively. If you don't, I'm going to put the vicar's sacks up your arseholes and pour them out through your nostrils. That will get all the homo out of you, and then I'll make you fucking eat them. Steve the labourer sniggered. What are you laughing at, cunt? Start digging with them. Les stomped off back to his flask. Steve adjusted his stance, shoulders back, moustache out. Come on then, get digging, he said, behind gritted teeth. The first trench was relatively easy. The soil was very dry, but surprisingly light and easy to cut with spade and shovel. The trench stretched from side to side of the aisle, about 7 foot wide, and when we bottomed out, found chalk at around 4 feet deep. No bodies, zombies, devils, or vampires evident at any time during the dig. The work was still tiring, as everything had to go over the shoulder. It took about 2.5 hours to dig the first trench. There is a science in digging. Most people don't appreciate this in any way. Why would anyone? The sides of the trench must be upright and clean cut, the bottom flat and even to ensure equal distribution of the load and for consistent depth of concrete. Leslie's inspection of his criteria was rigorous and very unforgiving. Me and Dave would look at him lingeringly, hoping for praise, but would not happen for some time later on this job. Looking for positive acknowledgement was like the search for the Holy Grail or a date with Mandy Harris, or Mandy Maybe, as we used to so often call her. One thing that was very noticeable from the start of the job was going home every night smelling like a gravedigger, or at least what I perceived of how a gravedigger smelt. It was a damp kind of musty, cabbagey smell that hung in your clothes, in your hair, and on your skin. Mother was often not happy about me walking to the house after a day at work anyway. A particularly nasty job with chimneys the year before had already ensured that my work clothes had to come off in the porch before entering the main house. A giggle for some of the girls in the neighbourhood, a disgrace to, seemingly, to everyone else. A bloody embarrassment for me, but this dusty, smelly demure was the whole new level of annoyance for her, I think. What is that smell? Graves? Graves, are you sure? What kind of bloody job have you got? I think you're lying. I'm going to ring Mr. Galbraith. The phone call was quick, and Mother never said another word. Not sure she had believed a word that came out of my mouth as a teenager anyway, but literally anybody, and I mean anybody, could give a report of me, and it was cut in stone. To this day, I'm not sure what she thought I was up to with the smell thing. I think probably she just didn't want to believe in the whole grave digging thing. No one else wanted to believe it. Although my father did find it quite amusing and always asked me if I found any skulls or treasure, reminding me that finders is always keepers, and I never found any treasure anyway. As it turns out, later on the vicar told us that as a rule, in the times when most of the people were dug up, we were buried in their graves, were usually robbed within 48 hours. That's one of those things I wish I'd known at the start of the job. It would have saved me quite a lot of sniffing around. The second trench that what was going to dig would be 8. It proved to be a very difficult experience from the first. There was also a new turn of events as Les and his brother, Steve, began digging the third trench at the same time as me, and Dave started digging trench 2. I think Les had worked out that sitting on his arse waiting for me and Dave to dig the trenches, while excellent for baiting, would be very boring and less profitable. There were two sides to the coin, good side and a bad side. First, now there would be less trenches for me to dig, and we would get to the bricklaying part quicker. This was excellent, but now Les would see this as a competition, so it would now be two teenage boys against two in their prime, 30-year-old males, and much as Les hated digging, he was, of course, really good at it. This was not good. However, 3 feet down, it got weird anyway. There was a strange, different slap sound as I cleaved out the side of a trench, and a roundish, yellowy thing poked out of the side of the trench. "What the fuck is that?" Dave asked, with a vacant look on his already vacant face. "I don't know," I said. "Touch it." "I don't think so." Les, as I said his name, I thought I'd made a mistake. Les could look at this. "For fuck's sake," Les roared. He had obviously found his stride digging. "What is it?" "There's something sticking out the side of the trench." "What does it look like?" "Cancer yellow, knobbly thing?" "That's Dave's cock," chipped in Steve. Les shuffled up next to the edge of the trench. "Dig around it. Carefully," he said. I chipped away with the tip of the spade, and it fell into the trench. About the length of the spade end, a twisted, deep, yellow branch-looking thing. Les grabbed a sack. "That's a thigh bone. Stick it in the sack and crack on, you fucking puff." My hands trembled as I tried to overcome everything in my head that was telling me not to touch the dead thing. It felt cold and squashy. I gripped too hard with my fingers, went into the spongy bone. My stomach did somersaults. I literally thought I was going to shit myself. At this point in my life, this was the closest I had ever been to death. I dropped it as I retracted my hand at the speed of light. Dave jumped clear of the trench. "What the fuck?" he screamed. Get that away from me." I literally had no idea how to react at this point. I did not know whether to laugh at Dave for being a bigger pussy than me or scream myself about what I just touched. Les stared at me very intensely. "What's that on your hand?" He pointed. I looked at my hand. There was a black inky type substance covering the palm. I went to brush it off onto my jeans. "Don't do that," Les shouted. "That's the Black Death boy." "What? What do you mean?" I looked pathetically at Les, unable to process what he just said. "They used to bury plague victims here. That's plague juice on your hands, so you're going to be a dead little boy now." Leslie's eyes were wide and stoic, his vampirish nose grizzled back in grim determination. I didn't doubt his words for a second. Dave screamed and ran out of the church. Cowardly little prick. Why wasn't it him that touched the fucking bone instead? Steve stood behind Les with his hand over his mouth, rigid, white-faced and eyes shut. What should I do? I could feel tears welling up, and I felt a drop fall from my left eye, and my knees started to tremble almost uncontrollably. "Get yourself to the office." Quick, smart, and get Mr. Galbraith to ring for an ambulance. Quick now, ask him to ring your mother too, as she will never see you alive again. Quick now. I leapt out the trench and ran out the church. It was lucky that the job was in the same village as the main office, literally 10 minutes down the high street. I covered the distance in 5 minutes with Les's booming voice in my head. Run, he said, run for your life. I arrived at the yard, becoming almost blind with panic and fear. The carpenter Colin was in the oak workshop. What's happened? He asked. I have the plague, I cried and ran into Mr. Galbraith's office, past Elizabeth, the secretary, who desperately tried to stop me barging in. Entering Mr. Galbraith's office without an appointment was a mortal sin, but this was not a consideration as I felt my life rapidly slipping away. I ran into his office and was immediately hit by a thick, acrid smoke that constantly pervaded his office due to his 100-a-day smoking habit. He looked up from his desk, his pupils slowly appearing above the rim of his downward-bound glasses. What is the meaning of this? I pulled a bone out from the side of the trench. It squashed into my hands and calm, boy, calm now, stay calm. Look, there's all this black stuff. I held my shaking hand out in front of him. Les said it's the plague, the thick black death, and I'm going to die if I don't get to hospital quickly. I heard a snigger behind me. Not sure whether it was Colin or Elizabeth, but it made me feel like bursting into tears. I was genuinely scared beyond belief. What the fuck is anyone laughing at? I thought. Sit down, Mr. Galbraith, put his glasses on and lit a cigarette. The Black Death, you say? From some bones. Just have a moment and think about that. I sat down. Brush that stuff off your hand. Do you think you could catch the plague like that? Do you think you can still catch the plague these days? Ever think? Mr. Galbraith picked up the phone. I was sure he was going to ring for an ambulance or a doctor. Hello, Mrs. Turner. Just to let you know, I'm sending your boy home now. He'll be on the bus and we'll be having the next couple of days off. He's been working really hard and an extra couple of days will be good for him. Okay, goodbye. He put the phone down, took a long drag from his cigarette and looked me straight in the eye. I do not appreciate you barging into my office, and if you ever do it again, that would be the very last time you ever did it. I want you to get your stuff and go home now. Don't say anything. Don't think anything. Just off your trot and come back on a Monday when you have stopped being a complete cunt. Now fuck off. I left the office, got my stuff and went home. Obviously I didn't have the plague. Apparently it took Les several hours to stop laughing about the whole thing that afternoon. Steve couldn't believe it either and claimed he nearly pissed his pants, particularly when it looked like I was going to start crying. The hand over the mouth was to prevent guffawing. Dave had not quite got the joke and Les had to threaten to beat him to start work in the church again. Mr. Galbraith and Les did have words about the incident. Les was actually very upset and I'd been sent home, mainly because he would have to do more digging than he'd anticipated for longer that week. Returning to work on Monday was, of course, embarrassing and humiliating, which gave the boys even further amusement. At the yard in the morning, Colin the carpenter gave me an article from a book about the plague to add to the fun, and completed my feeling of being a complete idiot. I wanted to tell them all to fuck off, of course, but I was not in a position to, as Les had no sense of humour about that kind of behaviour, even though most people might expect that kind of reaction. So I had to swallow hard and put that one down to experience, as with all the other jolly japes of horror I would experience. The trench work continued, and the bones experience got more intense. As we got nearer the altar, we started exhuming a lot more. One or two nearly whole skeletons. Never any skulls, though. Sometimes the body would face a different direction. The vicar told us that the vicars would be buried the other way round to their congregation, so that they faced them on the day of resurrection. Les used to say this was a load of old shit, and it was just keep our eyes open for treasure, particularly as the trenches were getting much deeper as we got near the altar, and to keep digging. And so keep digging we did. And then something else happened.